welcome to everybody this evening. We've got a real eclectic bunch from all over the world. Canada, Saudi Arabia, America, lots from South Africa and all other parts of the world. Welcome. I'm Lynette Rudman. I'll be your host this evening. And I'm coming to you live from Grahamstown in South Africa. This webinar is being recorded, and in a few days' time, it will be posted on our Learn the Birds YouTube channel. If you have any questions and answers for Al to answer after his presentation, please pop them in the chat box below. Now, our special guest is Al Uwe. I hope I've said your surname right. He is the professor of biology at the University of Rochester, New York. He was born and raised in the Philippines, and he moved to the USA in his early teens. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of California at Berkeley and his doctorate degree from the University of Maryland at College Park. For over 25 years, Al and his team have explored the ecology and evolution of avian biological diversity, working in countries like Australia, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, as well as Ecuador, Panama, and Costa Rica. His work in the Solomon Islands is featured in Islands of Creation, a documentary produced by the Smithsonian Channel, and is now available to stream through Paramount Plus. And Al's going to be talking about the biological diversity we see today is the result of new species evolving and older species going extinct. Therefore, to effectively conserve biodiversity, we need to understand both the processes that cause extinction and those that give rise to new species. And he will be unraveling Charles Darwin's mystery of mysteries. Over to you, Al. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks everyone for joining us. It's pretty cool to see a very wide distribution globally of in the audience. So let me share my screen. I'm going to minimize this. Okay, perfect. So thank you again for this opportunity to talk to folks. I always enjoy talking to the public a little bit about what we do. Some of the work I'll be talking about has been projects that have been ongoing for many decades, but the focus of today's talk will really be more about a project that has been going on for about 15 years. And this is in the beginning of Darwin's book, Origin of Species, he called the origin of species, or how species are created, as the mystery of mysteries. So I want to talk about some of the work we're doing that tries to unravel the mystery of mysteries, as well as end today's talk with the way we extend our scientific work to more applied science. Okay, let me see here. So before I start, I want to say thank you, of course, to our key partners. This is the team in the Solomon Islands that have been working with me for the past 15 to 20 years. Their help is what makes any of our work possible. And of course, key funding agencies from the National Science Foundation of the US government to Nat Geo, Conservation International, and two major universities that have helped both start and continue my work, the University of Miami and the University of Rochester. And of course, my partner in crime, my wife, who's also a biologist who works with me in many of these projects. Okay, so this is, some of you may see, or especially those that are in the United States and Canada, this is a collage of some of the birds that you could see in North America. And I don't think you need to be a birder to fully appreciate the stunning diversity of birds on the planet. And one obvious thing that stands out, one way to think of this diversity and how it's generated is through each organism's ecology. And in this case, how they make a living. So for example, you have species here that eat meat, some eat insects, some are seed eaters like this cardinal, and of course, some are nectar feeders like this hummingbird. And so one axis of diversification of the origin of species could be in the way animals live, their ecology. One interesting thing to note, though, is if you zoom in, and let's say these are warblers, these are New World warblers of the New World. If you zoom in them, you can see that all these species are insect eaters, so they have a very similar ecology from a general sense. They have the same way to make a living. But what's really striking from this collage is basically that the main difference, or one of the main differences you see, is in the color of the plumage. And that is basically another axis that populations can diversify. This is the way animals communicate to each other. Of course, this has been exaggerated in other species in the world. This is the famous birds of paradise, where they may have difference in ecology and where they live and what they do, but the most striking difference among them is these stunning plumage that has been evolved by males. And so what I want to explore today is how scientists like myself explore this diversity to understand where it comes from and how it's maintained in nature. And then ultimately, as I said, I wanted to share how we are linking our basic science to more applied science. I'm going to start off with almost every evolution talk that you might hear always starts off with Charles Darwin, who wrote this very instrumental and foundational book, The Origin of Species, where he described a process that would explain how populations in the world adapt to their environment. And it comes down to this quote from his book, that basically the preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of bad variation is a process he called natural selection. And this allows nature to hone in for organisms to adapt explicitly to the kind of environment they live in. But of course, when you think of signals like this, or the way animals communicate, it's not intuitive to think of it as a way for them to survive and to be more fit, right? Because one would think there would be predators that would go after them if they're overly colorful or if they're overly conspicuous. And so Darwin wrote a follow-up book, a lesser known but equally important book called The Descent of Man and the Selection in Relation to Sex. And here he describes the mechanisms that he thinks that would generate these kinds of diversified animal communication, animal signals. And here he's, instead of advantage to survival or to feeding or in ways they make a living, the idea of sexual selection is more for the competition solely in respect to reproduction. And of course, he gets very little credit or less credit. Alfred Russel Wallace also came up with very similar, if not almost identical, mechanisms for the generation of adaptations and sexual signals, like the colorful birds of paradise. So how does selection work? The neat thing about natural selection and sexual selection in the same mechanism is its simplicity. So we can start off, and this is looking at Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands. Let's say we start off with a population where there's variation. You know, just like if you probably turned on the cameras in this chat, we will see a lot of variation in skin color, hair color in humans. In all organisms, there is variation, right? So in this example here, let's look at a population of finches that vary in the size of their beaks. And maybe some of these individuals, based on their morphology, their physical trait, they can do better than others in doing something. In this case, eating seeds. So maybe this big beaked individuals would eat bigger seeds better than the small individuals. And likewise, the small individuals can be eating these small seeds better than the big individuals. So if something happens in the environment, in this case, let's say there was a drought and all the big seeds disappeared and only the small seeds were around, the big birds will suffer and only the small birds will do well. And so the big birds, let's say, die while the small birds do really, really well and basically take over the population. And as long as the trait that allowed them to take advantage of that unique situation, the small seeds, can be passed on to the next generation, then you can have selection, natural selection, evolution by natural selection happening. So these good traits, small beak size, pass on to the next generation, and eventually the whole population then becomes filled with small beaked birds, right? So as I said, you can start with this variable population that maybe after a strong bout of selection and all the big seeds disappeared, only the small birds survive and reproduce. If you do this over and over and over again, then you really get a population that is now different from the way it started from. And if there's enough changes that accumulate through time, then you can have reproductive barriers evolving to prevent the mix of the two individuals. So for example, if it's really an advantage to eat small seeds, you would not want to mate and produce offspring with an individual with big beaks and vice versa. And so if you complete this, if you repeat this iteration over and over and over again, like what happened in the Galapagos archipelago for a couple million years, you start off from a single population of birds that colonized Galapagos that ate seeds to those that started eating insects, some that are eating fruits, some cactus, specialized in cactus, and then some retained the seed eating propensity, but different size seeds. So this iteration of nature picking the better variant for many, many generations results in this diversification in the origin of species in nature. So it ultimately boils down to this, right? There are favorable variation, both in the ability to survive, but also an advantage to the ability to reproduce. And so the key to understanding the diversity species, what Darwin called the mystery of mysteries, is really understanding how natural and sexual selection operates. So with this in mind, the work that I want to talk about today is our long-term project in the Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands is just an archipelago just east of New Guinea in Australia. Here's a blow-up size of the island. And just to give you an idea of how hard our field work is, this is the typical day of our field work where we look out into the Pacific to see the beautiful day there. So the two projects we'll talk about today is the long-term project in flycatchers. And this is a single species of flycatchers that have changed in plumage color across islands. And many have thought that this could be a cool or a really key example of the origin of species when populations are just starting to change so that eventually they become distinct species. As of now, these populations are considered a single species that are variable across the Solomon Island chain. The next project I'll briefly talk about after the flycatcher is a newer project we started looking at honey eaters. These are nectar feeding birds where a unique situation happened where these red species evolved in isolation from this black species, and a couple of hundred years ago, they came into contact. And that is a natural experiment for us to see what happens when you have young species come together to prevent them from becoming and basically mixing and losing their species boundaries. So let's start with the flycatchers. Here's our key player. Here's a male chestnut-bellied flycatcher named for its chestnut-bellied. They're Australasians found in Australia and throughout Asia and the South Pacific. As the name implies, flycatcher, they are insectivorous birds that basically glean off leaves to hunt for insects. Socially, males and female pair bond and defend territories, breeding territories against other pairs. And as I said, the neat thing about them is they're variable throughout the archipelago. So here's a map of the Solomon Islands. In all these orange islands here, males and females look like this: black on top, chestnut-bellied in the bottom. When you get to the blue islands here, this is the island of Bougainville, they still have the chestnut belly and black upper parts, but now they have a white crescent moon in front of their eyes. In the New Georgia chain here, this is a younger volcanic island chain in the Solomon Archipelago. Individuals still have the chestnut-bellied and black backs, but now they have this beautiful white crest. The neat thing, and where we really have focused the past few years, is in this small islands, satellite islands off this bigger orange islands, birds do not have the chestnut belly and instead are entirely black, or what's called melanic. And last but not the least, we're also looking at this population. The only populations where the two kinds of flycatchers still coexist. In the Russell Archipelago here, you have some individuals having the chestnut belly and black upper parts, while also in the same population, you can have an entirely black or melanic birds. Now, on top of the plumage differences, over the past decade, we discovered that their songs are also different. So in these islands that are color-coded now, They have this very simple flycatcher, kind of very sad, melodious, single note song in the way they communicate with each other. But the melanic birds have this more complex double whistle note. And interestingly, the chestnut-bellied bird next to them in the orange island here have a song that's more similar to the melanic birds. So the neat thing about these birds is not only do they differ in their color, but also in their song. So they're different in two ways that they can communicate with each other. So the first question we wanted to ask when we started this project is, what is the evolutionary history of this group? Are they really closely related young populations that are splitting into many species? And so to do this, and we had to construct basically a family tree, but in a longer time scale for these birds, right? So here, for example, is a family tree where we can trace the lineage. Charles Darwin, who got married to his cousin Emma Wedgwood. So we can create this family tree, but in the bird's case, we can create this, but in evolutionary timescales of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And we do that through genetics with a very simple way to do this is that basically we can sequence each bird, look at their genetic makeup, and the assumption is that the more similar they are, the more closer relatives they are. Just like brothers are closer to each other than a brother is to that person is to their cousin. And we can then use what's called a gene tree or a phylogenetic tree to reconstruct the evolutionary history of birds the same way we can do it with relatives in humans. And if we do that, this is what we get. This is a sister species, an unrelated, a less related species, the eyelet monarch in New Guinea. They're chestnut-bellied, but with a gray back upper parts. And basically what we discovered is about 500,000 years ago is when they split with this, what's called sister species, or the most closely related species. And that entire archipelago, Solomon Archipelago clade, forms as one group, and they start splitting as they jump from island to island. And the neat one here, for example, is this group here where the melanic birds are found close to those chestnut birds and they sing similar songs. About a couple 100,000 years ago, they started splitting into the melanic form and the chestnut form. For us, that seems like a long time ago, but for evolutionary time, this is a blink of an eye. And so they are still young and they're still at that verge of becoming new species. So one of the first things we wanted to ask then is, so as a biologist and maybe as a birder, you saw, oh, these birds are black, the other one are chestnut-bellied. That's neat. They might be different groups of population. But what we wanted to know is whether the birds themselves consider different colors as different populations or a different species altogether, right? So one possibility is that these black birds recognize these chestnut birds as members of their own population, and so they'll just breed with no problem. They'll pair up, make a nest and produce babies, no problem. Of course, the alternative extreme of this is that they're so different that the blackbirds only mate and produce young with the blackbirds, and the chestnut birds only produce young with the chestnut birds. And if they are indeed young species, then the alternative would be that there is still partial, they could still make mistakes and still breed with each other, but in the general sense, the black ones still breed with only the melanic birds and the chestnut ones with the chestnut birds, but there's reproductive barriers that are still keeping them apart, even though there's mistakes happening, right? So we wanted to test this. So obviously this is a test you can't do by just asking the birds, the way, you can have a survey in humans. And so one thing we did, this is now over 10 years ago, is we created taxidermy mount of different birds of different colors. And under a speaker underneath, hidden in these leaves, is an iPod and where we can play the song of the bird. And basically the idea here is, as I mentioned earlier, males and female defend their territories from other birds from their own species because they're competing for something, right? And so if, for instance, a melanic bird sees a melanic mount with a melanic song and then attacks it, it means it's attacking it because it's a competitor. Now, to distinguish between a competitor for food versus a competitor for mates, we can then present that same black bird, that same black male, with another bird species, in this case, a species called the golden whistler, that eats the same food and lives in the same habitat as the flycatcher. So in other words, if these melanic birds attacked this golden whistlers, it means they are attacking because they're competing for food and resources, right? So what do they do? Here is an example of a chestnut bird that's really angry at a chestnut mount, and really showing that they do recognize it as an intruder, either ecological intruder or a sexual competitor. So we did this experiment throughout the islands, a total of 60 territories in this melanic population in Santa Ana, and 55 territories in this chestnut-bellied population close to Santa Ana. And again, the distance between these two sites is about 10 kilometers, which for a bird is basically like walking across the street, right? So it's a very easy distance for a bird to traverse. And so this is a fairly realistic experiment, because I think once in a while they do see each other. So here's what we found. These on the bottom are the different combinations of the taxidermy mount and the song. So this is a chestnut mount with a chestnut song. This will be a chestnut mount with a black song, a black mount with a chestnut song, black mount, black song, and then that golden whistler control for ecological competitors. Testing males from the chestnut-bellied population. And on the vertical axis here is a score of aggression. Positive high scores means the birds recognized and attacked, just like what we saw from that video. A negative score would mean they ignored it, meaning they didn't recognize it as a competitor. So the first thing we found is that basically that ecological competitor was ignored. So they are not competing for food in this sense if they do attack something. When you present chestnut birds with chestnut mountain songs, they do respond just like we saw in that video and attack. When you give them a black mount and a black song, they attack less or ignore it for the most part. And if you mix and match the song and the mounts, you see an intermediate response. So what this suggests is that these chestnut-bellied birds are using both mount color and the song as a way to recognize competitors from the same species. And so they're using these plumage colors and song as a way to recognize members of their own population. And we see the same thing when we ran the experiment with the blackbirds. They ignored the ecological competitors. If they were faced with a black taxidermy mount with a black song, they attack. A chestnut mount, chestnut song, they don't attack, and the intermediate is somewhere in the middle. So we are fairly convinced now that at least the males are using the color, which are different between population, and the song, which is somewhat different between populations, as a way to recognize members of their own species and in a way to find mates. So the hypothesis that we basically find support for is that one way that these different plumage patterns across islands can be used is to recognize their own species. And it also allows them to at least minimize pairing up with the wrong individuals from the wrong population. And these colors in particular affects their ability to find mates and to defend territories. So the next question is, how is this being passed on from generation to generation? As we talked about with the way natural and sexual selection works, is that the trait that's good, black plumage or chestnut plumage, needs to be passed on to the next generation. Otherwise, it's an evolutionary dead end. So to do this, we started looking at the molecules involved in creating color. So we know this in many vertebrates that melanin, the pigment that creates this coloration, brown or black or gray, is embedded either in your skin cells, in our hair, or in feathers in birds. And they are produced by this cell type called melanocytes. They kind of produce melanin, and then it gets deposited in the skin, or in our case, some cases the hair, or in the case of birds, in their feather. We know the regulation of this cell, the melanocyte, is regulated by a protein called melanocortin-1 receptor, MC1R, with another receptor called attractin to help it. And what we know is that if it's bound to a free-floating protein called MSH, it turns on the melanocyte to produce black pigments, dark pigments, called eumelanin. If, on the other hand, another protein called agouti attaches to MC1R and that attractin protein, it turns off the melanocyte, and then the melanocyte produces pheomelanin, which is this lighter coloration of kind of beige or brown or light gray. So we know the molecular mechanisms that underlie color or at least dark coloration in many vertebrates. And so what I wanted to do then is to look at the MC1R of these birds. So here again is the melanocyte. This is the surface layer of the melanocyte. This is MC1R that's embedded within the surface layer. And each one of these circles is an amino acid. And we looked at the genetic sequence that controls the creation of these amino acids. And what we found was there's a single mutation in position 119 here that creates, that changes an aspartic acid with a negative charge amino acid to an asparagine that has a neutral charge. And so we wanted to see if there's an association between aspartic acid or asparagine to being a bird of a particular color. So birds, like humans, have two copies of the chromosome, one from mom and one from dad. And so what we basically found is that birds with two copies of aspartic acid here in orange, 45 out of 48 birds here from the Big Island, had a chestnut belly. If, on the other hand, you had two copies of asparagine, these 22 out of the 25 birds in the melanic population, you have this black belly. So what happens if you have one copy of each, one copy of aspartic acid and one copy of asparagine? And what we found is some rare birds that have one copy of each are intermediate in color, half brown, half black. So we were pretty excited because it suggests that the single mutation creates an entirely black bird or a chestnut bird. And if you get one copy of each, you're halfway, you're intermediate. But the genome of a bird is massive, right? And so recently, with new advances in sequencing technology, we were able to sequence the entire genome of a bunch of birds. This is 1.3 billion base pairs of DNA. And then now we can ask, if we scan the entire genome, are there other changes that could be linked or could be creating the black plumage or the chestnut plumage? And here's what we found. So this, again, we sequenced a bunch of chestnut birds, black birds, and these intermediate birds. On the horizontal axis here, you can think of it as we're marching throughout the chromosomes of the entire genome of these birds. On the vertical axis is how well those particular regions of the genome predict whether you're going to be a black bird or a chestnut bird. And the red line here is the line of where we cut off that it's really a strong predictor. And what we found is that most of the genome is a poor predictor, which makes sense. They share most of their genome, with the exception of one point here in the 11th chromosome of birds. That is a small chunk of the genome that predicts whether you're going to be black or a chestnut bird. And what we found is that basically that MC1R gene is right smack in the middle of that, and it's really a high predictor. So we were pretty relieved that the only region that predicts plumage color that we found when we first looked at just one gene, the MC1R, is also the only region that predicts whether you're going to be a black or a chestnut bird when we look at the entire genome of these birds. This is a complex analysis, so I'm just going to mention it quickly, but we were also able to describe the history of those changes in that gene MC1R, and we can reconstruct its history. And basically what we found is that if you go back in time, that mutation that created the black birds, in this case, the gene tree here that's blue is the melanic, the black mutation. What happens there is basically it evolved a long time ago, 77,000 generations ago. And natural selection only kicked in. So this is following the fate of that mutation through time, black mutation, pretty rare. And then something happened about 1,200, 2,000 years ago where it jumped up and where something was selected for. And what we think is basically in those small islands, there was enough black birds and they started favoring each other. And then eventually that entire island became black birds. And this is what we see here, where that mutation to be black basically went in and was 100%, almost 100% found in those small islands. But if you're still awake and paying attention, you probably thought, what about those blackbirds to the north? Because the ones we were talking about were blackbirds here. And what we found is basically that those birds did not have the MC1R mutation and instead had a mutation in this agouti, this other protein that binds to MC1R. And what we found is a single point mutation again, and now in position 55 of agouti, that if you look at their composition, every single black bird on that northern island had 2 copies of one amino acid called threonine, while even these blackbirds here from the Santa Ana population that's melanic has 2 copies of what's called isoleucine. So in this case, basically, natural selection, evolution found 2 ways to create the same bird. In Santa Ana, it was a mutation in MC1R, but in Ugi, that northern population, it was a mutation in another protein that created the same kind of bird, but now in a different mutation that interacts with MC1R. So for this first part, I just want to summarize what we found. That basically that plumage and color vary across island. It's important for individuals to find the correct members of their own population, and that a simple change, a simple mutation in these proteins that control the color of the feathers can be passed on from generation to generation. And if natural or sexual selection picks it up, you can create the generation of new species relatively quickly. So what we were finding, and we were pretty excited about this result, is that you don't need very complex changes in the genomes to start the origin or to kick off the creation of new species or biodiversity. Let me move on now to this newer project. It'll be a shorter one because it's a much new project in this secondary, what's called secondary contact of these birds, the honey eater. So here's our new player, the Myzomala honey eaters of the South Pacific and New Guinea and Australia. They're old world nectar feeders. So for those living in the New World tropics, this is convergent, evolved the same as hummingbirds. Like the flycatchers, they're socially monogamous. They typically produce a couple of eggs in their clutch of nests. And males and females both protect and provide parental care, with females providing more of the provisioning and males providing more of the defense of the nest. So what we're finding here is something pretty neat, where it's kind of reversed. On the big island of Makira, where we had those chestnut-bellied birds, the honey eater there is entirely black. In fact, it's an endemic species found only on the island of Makira. When you get to the smaller islands to the north, where there was the melanic chestnut-bellied flycatchers, what we get instead are these cardinal honey eaters that are basically red, bright red with some black. So there's very distinct populations or species, actually. And the neat thing about it is this red and black cardinal honey eater is actually not just found on these small islands of Ugi and Three Sisters, but also all throughout the South Pacific here, including from New Caledonia through Vanuatu and all the way to the Solomon Archipelago. So they're much more widespread. And the thought is that they're only recently colonized. They're moving up north from New Caledonia, presumably probably starting from Australia, moving their way to the Solomons. And it's only relatively recent that they made their way to the Solomon Islands. From the evolutionary history, folks have studied this, and we just know from basically reconstructing their history that they have been separated for at least a couple of million years. So these 2 species have been evolving independently alone for a couple of million years. And now we have a chance to see what happens if they naturally come together. So as I said, this is the map I was mentioning to you in the Solomon Islands. About 200 years ago, based on museum collection, it looks like the red species eventually colonized the big island and are restricted along the coast of the northern part of the island. They're not found in the coast of the southern part of the island, or this is a mountainous region in the middle of the mountains of the big island. So all along the coast here in the north, the black species and the red species come together, now giving us an experiment to see what would happen if 2 populations that was once isolated come into contact. So it's called secondary contact. And a famous ornithologist, Ernst Mayr and Jared Diamond, called this the moment of truth for understanding the origin of species. What will happen for these isolated populations finally come into contact? So over the year, for the past 10 years, we've been sampling in all these yellow dots throughout these islands. And what I'm going to talk about today briefly is, again, more sequencing, more because we're so excited that we can do this with wild species, where we sequence the entire genome of this time 160 different birds to try to start understanding their history and what is the consequence of coming together in the same habitat. I'll walk you through this one. Basically, this is, we looked at their entire genome and we looked at parts of their chromosomes that's inherited from mother and daughter and father to son. We found almost 2.5 million sites in the genome that is variable across individuals. And we can use that to infer what kind or what is their place of origin, their ancestry. So in other words, there's very distinct genetics for red birds and very distinct genetics for blackbirds. And so in this bar graph here, on the vertical axis here is their ancestry, either 0 ancestry for a particular population to 100% one ancestry for another population. And each of these columns is an individual bird. So this group here where my arrow is are birds from this island. This group here are red birds from this island. And this group here are black birds from the middle of the island. And the color represents where they come from in terms of their ancestry. So basically all the birds from this red island have a red ancestry. Their genome tells you they come from the red population. These red birds from this islands are about 95, 98% ancestry from the red with a little bit of black ancestry. And here, the blackbirds in the middle of the big island almost have a 100% ancestry to the black species, with an exception, this one bird has a little bit of red. So what happens to the birds that are sharing the same place, the ones that come into secondary contact? So here, they look a little bit weirder. So on these areas, the yellow dots here where they come into contact, these are all the red birds where I'm circling. You can see all these red birds now have a lot of black ancestry. Similarly, all these black birds here have a lot of red ancestry. And in fact, we found a bunch of birds, like here in the picture, that looks like a hybrid between the red and the black, meaning they're mostly black with a little bit of red scattered around their body. And if you look at their ancestry, they're almost half black and half red. So they really are a product of wrong, if you want to call it that, matings between blackbirds and red birds. Now, we know this for many, many vertebrates, that there are specific chromosomes in our body that is inherited by sex. So these are called the sex chromosomes. So in birds, unlike mammals, if you inherit 2 of the Z chromosome, you're a male. If you have a Z and a W chromosome, you're a female. And so we wanted to look at if there's something special about these chromosomes that are inherited by sex. And again, this is the same breakup. The main thing to see here is that in the region where they come into contact, unlike the rest of the chromosomes, the rest of the genome, these red birds and black birds are mostly red with just a little bit of black, or mostly black with a little bit of red. And those hybrid or intermediate birds are still somewhere in the middle. So what this suggests is that if I go backwards, if you look at the rest of the chromosomes, there's more leakage between the 2 species than if you look at what these called sex chromosomes. So what's super interesting now is if we look at the W, because remember the W is only passed on to females from mother to daughter. And here what you see, so these are just the females. Again, all the red birds in isolation are red, all the black birds in isolation are black. You see all the red birds where they come into contact have red W. What's neat is that these are blackbirds here. If you have them in hand, they look totally black, but a bunch of them, 4 in this case, have a red species chromosome. And if you look at the hybrids, the ones that are mixed ancestry, all of them have a red W or W sex chromosome. So what this suggests is there's a one-way movement of the female sex chromosome where red females are probably mating with black males, but not vice versa. We never see red birds with black sex chromosomes. So it looks like it's going one way. So this one way of movement of female sex chromosome. Why is that happening? So let's create a scenario here where you may be a red female and maybe you mate with a black bird, black male, and you produce a half black, half red baby right here. Or you could be a black female, you mate with a red bird, and again, you produce this case. But this is the scenario where we're not finding any of the black sex chromosome being passed on to the red population. So what could be happening? Either this pair up, a black female never pairs up with a red, but a red female can sometimes pair up with a black. Or it could be that they do pair up. Black females do pair up with the red, but there's a problem with the hybrids. The hybrids die. Maybe there's some genetic disorder or something that's preventing the passage of the female W from a black population to the red population. Can we distinguish between these two possibilities? So for starters, what we did last year, or actually this year, is we went back to the field and found a bunch of nests. And with the help of local communities, we found almost over 51 nests where we have the data of the mom and dad. So it's all scrunched up because we focus in one area here. Nests where you have a red male and a red female are in red. Nests where you have a black male and a black female are black, and any kind of mixed pairings are in aqua. Let's zoom in. That's the distribution of the nests we found. So the first thing we kind of observed is that there is, if you blur your eyes, you're going to see maybe that red birds are closer to the coast and black birds are more interior, which makes sense if the red birds are only found in the coast. And in fact, if we measure the distance of the nest, the average distance of a nest from the seashore, from the coast, we see that red birds are closer to the shore. Here's the distance from the shore, from on the shore to 1,200 kilometers. Red birds are closer to the shore, black birds are further away from the shore, and those hybrid or mixed nests are intermediate to the two. So it already looks like they're partitioning where they build their nest. So the question is what's going on with those mixed birds? Do we only see red females with black birds, or do we also see black birds sometimes pairing with red birds? Just to show how cute they are, these are the nests. These are nestlings, maybe 5 or 6 days old. Some are near the ground, easy to access. Most of them are pretty high up. And because of our local collaborators who are excellent climbers, we were able to sample nests. So what were we finding? So of the 51 nests, 24 or 25 were red to red. About 15 were black and black. So what's going on with all the mixed ones? So here are females that are red, paired up with either a mixed male or a black male. So this is, as we would predict, these are females with the red W, right? Do we ever see a black female paired up with a red male or an intermediate bird? And yes, we do. So these particular bird, this is a black female mixed with a hybrid or intermediate male. These are black females with a red male. So we do see the pairing of these black females with red males. So what we think might be going on is this. Basically, they do pair up, but there might be something wrong with their offspring. And that's where we're testing now. We're looking at the genomic data sets to see if there are certain combinations of the genome that is not passed on to the next generation, hinting at this something is going wrong when a black female mates with a red bird. So that's ongoing. Okay, so a lot of these things are cool and fun to think about of how diversity is being generated, how you can relate your long-term field work with genetic data. In the end, we always want to be able to relate our work to a broader benefit to society. So how can we link some of the things we're doing in the field, like in the Solomon Islands, to the betterment of society? Can we use science to help deal with some of the greatest problems that we face? So we know that there's a great decline out there. So this is a census populations of birds in North America, for example, for the past 50 years, where we know populations have declined to the tune of about 3 billion birds lost in the past 50 years, right? So there's a steady and really precipitous, sad decline of bird population in North America. And it's not equally distributed across habitats. So for example, forest birds have lost clearly a decline of about 17%. But grassland birds have been the ones that are hit the hardest with a 50% decline. Regardless of where you look at it, there is an important and scary decline in bird populations in North America. But what about island birds? So globally, the global area of land, or at least livable land, is 140,000 square kilometers. Islands are a mere 5% of that. But when you look at diversity of birds, there's 10,000 species of birds roughly in the world. Almost 2,000, almost 20% of that is found on islands, which are relatively only 5% of the land mass. So islands are really important in generating endemics and as well as biodiversity. The sad thing, though, is islands are also the most susceptible. So recently, we've seen 137 bird extinctions in recent history, and of those, 95% came from islands, right? And of those that are endangered, there's currently 192 species of birds endangered, listed as endangered. Almost 60% of those are found only on islands. So clearly, islands are both important in generating diversity, but also one of the most susceptible. And we know that this is a major problem globally, where most, if not all, scientists now agree that we have faced the 6th mass extinction event of our planet. And this is because we're losing habitats. We are harvesting animals at a quicker rate, and also we're introducing species that do not exist in a particular habitat from other habitats. We're mixing things up. So what do we do for this? And so over the past 5 or 6 years, I've been partnering with indigenous tribes, indigenous communities to try to help folks set up conservation areas. And the way I've been approaching this is not through the lens of a scientist, where I come in and tell them, oh, you got to do X, Y, and Z to save your habitat. But instead, it's a grassroots approach where we help communities build capacity so that they themselves could be the shepherd and the ones looking after the resources. So 3 communities in the Solomon Islands where we work, the Nasuafu, Carapena, and Poimarawa communities of Makira Island, have approached me over the past 5 or 6 years to set up what they call the Yato Protected Area. This is 30,000, roughly 30,000 acres, roughly 12,000 hectares of pristine forest that is owned and managed purely by these 3 communities. And they wanted to set up a federally protected, basically a national park. And luckily, I was able to find funding from Conservation International and a private foundation to try to set up this reserve. And this is super important because logging for the past decade has entered the Solomon Islands. So this is a map of all the logging roads that have entered Makira Island. And as you can see, very few spots, including in yellow here, what we're trying to protect, the Yato Protected Area, is left untouched. And so we are this is a literal race in time to protect these areas from international logging companies. Here's what it looks like when the logging roads are built in. And we're not talking about a trail. This is a massive tractor, and it's an indiscriminate harvesting of timber. And this is just zooming into the Yato Protected Area, just to give you a size. And this is what we're protecting. Cloud forests that are really untouched, beautiful lowland and high elevation rainforest, and important riverine systems that provide water to thousands of communities further downstream. And they empty into these beautiful estuaries and mangrove forests that the indigenous communities are highly dependent on. So to declare a federally protected conservation area, we have to show that it's worth it to the government, right? And so about 5, 6 years ago, we did a bird survey in the area. And what we found is within that 30,000 acres, 12,000 hectares of the Yato Protected Area, there are 15 endemic species of birds and another 10 endemic subspecies. So a total of 25 really distinct population of birds that you do not find anywhere else on the planet, for a total of 43 species in that small area. We were pretty excited, and this is including our Myzomla honey-eater birds here, the black honey-eater. Unfortunately, for the past 10 years, we have failed to find this bird. This is the Makira moorhen, only known from a single museum specimen collected in the 1920s. For the past several years, including this summer, we set up these cameras to really find this bird, and it has not been found or sighted now for 20 or 30 years. And we may fear, it's not counted in that previous slide I mentioned to you, but we fear that this bird might actually be extinct. And we have an idea of why it's extinct, because this is what we see in our cameras. This is an endemic. This is the island thrush, a very cool bird that you can only find on Makira. This is the Melanesian megapode. It's a mound builder that's found throughout Melanesia. But one of the most common sightings we see in these traps, even in the most pristine areas of the study site, are these feral cats. So feral cats seem to be common even in the remote areas. And as you can see from this feral cat, he looks super healthy. And so what happens in many of these island systems is once you introduce a top predator that they've never been exposed to, these birds, the Makira moorhen is likely to be a flightless bird, can't compete and can't survive these invasive species. So we feel that maybe it's been extinct because of this. So we are basically one step away from declaring the protected area. We're just waiting on the Ministry of Environment to sign it. But luckily, I've also been able to negotiate and work with two non-government organizations, NACAO and Live and Learn, to do carbon trading with these communities. So from now till perpetuity, these communities are going to receive funding to protect the area so that they can do things like create schools and clinics and hospitals, provide money for scholarships for students to go to college and so forth. So we are very proud of this, is because we're not just entering a place and telling people what to do, right? We are actually capacity building, providing people with the tools that they can use to govern their own resources. But now we've been able to partner them with international institutions so that they can actually get money, because that's in the end of the day, that's what's going to help conserve these areas. So by partnering these communities after the protected area is declared with an NGO like NACAO, they can get the resources they need without having to resort to deforestation. And my goal now for the next 10, 15 years is to convince the remaining pristine areas of Solomon to create this network of protected areas that will span the entire island, so that we can conserve all those species of plants and animals that we're finding in this region. To do this, we do a lot of outreach. So these are school kids where we're playing the documentary that's created about our work. We go to schools and give lots of presentations. And we also do a lot of impromptu conversations. This one has happened to be on the side of a road where we're talking to communities and talking to them about the value of the resources, and hopefully engage them to participate and use Yato, the Yato protected area, as evidence that these kinds of things can work for them. And as I mentioned, if you're interested, Paramount Plus is still playing our documentary that talks about a lot of the stuff I talked about today. Or if you're interested, you can send me an email. I'll send you a private link that you can watch it. And so I just want to close with a little bit of, I always, when I talk to students and colleagues about these biodiversity loss, it's just so sad. But it's really important to also talk about why all of this understanding biodiversity matters. So this is a recent quote from one of the most famous conservation scientists in our generation, Jane Goodall, that it's not just losing diversity, but there are many things that are important when we conserve these habitats. This particular quote from her deals with COVID-19 and the impact of basically overhunting and logging and trafficking results in closer contact with wildlife then creates zoonosis and the spread of things like COVID-19. But we are not far from being able to protect and stop things like this from happening. There are policies and laws that our government can pass, but more importantly, as Jane Goodall mentioned here, is we need to empower communities to do what they can do. And to do so, empowering means not just to give them the knowledge and tools that many of us already have and take for granted, but to provide them with an alternative way to make a living. And this is what we're trying to do with folks like the Yato community, where instead of logging, they can get funds by protecting their forest. So our hope is not just to do the science that we're doing, which is super exciting for us, and as bird nerds, we find great pleasure in doing, but also to use some of the work that we're doing to protect what we love to study for generations to come. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. And again, if you are more interested in some of the work we're doing, you can go to our website, the Trop Biolab, or shoot me an email. The email address is right there. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Al. That was really fantastic. I learned a lot from that talk. Please pop any questions into the comment section. I see there are some already. Here's the first one from Faraz. If this hybridization continues, is it possible to ascertain which population would ultimately form the majority? As in, if this continues, would the sooty cease to exist?
Yes. So there are many cases. So this is why it's been called the moment of truth. There's many cases where if two populations were evolving away from each other, let's say the red and the black, and if you bring them back too soon and they haven't changed enough, they can basically mix into become one. So they either become the dominant one, it could be the sooty, or they become the red one, or they become a completely different lineage where they're just a mix of the two. If, however, they have evolved enough to become distinct species, they may hybridize a little bit, but their identity is still kept in track. So right now we only have a few hundred years, so we won't really know what's going on, but it is looking like that despite the fact that there is hybridization happening, it is small enough to keep it apart and to keep them. And if we modeled it, we can probably guess that they will stay okay.
Yeah. And Diana asks, are there any mutations that take place because of environment?
Yes, I mean, environment can be a cause of mutations that can be passed on to the next generation. I mean, this is probably one of the greatest discoveries in Drosophila geneticists when they were using X-rays in the 1920s and 30s to create mutation for their experiments. So there are many mutations that can be created by environment. In fact, I have a lot of colleagues that are looking at nuclear reactor meltdowns and seeing if those populations have elevated rates of mutation versus areas that are far away from nuclear reactions. But yes, so there are those cases. They're hard to find, but that does happen.
Cool. Faraz asks again, is it possible for ecotourism to assist in funding and the protection of the Yato protected area?
Yeah, so we have been in conversation with many groups about this. One of the difficulties with the Yato and Makira, the island we work on, is its isolation. It's really hard to get to. And so our first conversation that's happening now is with the Solomon government to increase air traffic into the region. What we're finding is a lot of people, unless you're a diehard birder and you want to check off those 10 to 15 endemic species, they're not going to fly all the way to Makira because there's no infrastructure the way Fiji or other places where you can vacation. So our first step right now is talking to the Ministry of Tourism to see if we can facilitate ecotourism by first creating a situation where it makes it a lot easier for tourists to choose it. As of now, it's really hard to get to. And so the only ecotourists I've seen are birding companies that basically take people out there for that specific reason. They want to see those endemic. We hope someday that the air traffic will be better so that then we can start marketing it at a better way.
Thanks. Elizabeth asks, exactly how did you obtain genetic samples for the studies?
Yeah, so for I would say for 98% of what we do, we catch the birds with mist nets, we tag them with leg bands, as most of you know, and on their wing vein, the brachial vein, we basically puncture and collect blood samples. And there are buffers that allow us to preserve the blood in the field without refrigeration. And then when we bring it back to our lab, the DNA is actually well preserved, and then we extract it there and then keep it in the freezer. That's 98% of what we do. The small percent is like, for instance, when we created those taxidermy mounts, or if we have birds die accidentally, then we collect tissue. We collect heart and muscle and extract those. Yeah.
And then Faraz says again, I wonder if he shouldn't, let's unmute him, Derek. Let him. Okay. Derek.
Yeah, I'm looking. Just give me
can
a
you
second.
unmute Faraz? Let him ask himself this.
There you go, Faraz. You can unmute.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if you're ready for what you asked for. But yeah, really I'm working for a company. I am a photographer and birding guide. And we are supposed to be taking people to the Solomon Islands starting from next year. Specifically for people to search for these endemics. And obviously birding ethics is high on my list of priorities. So I don't want to do things where we cause any kind of damage to the ecosystem or damage to the birds themselves. And just looking for ways in which our presence there can positively impact the birds, the communities, and the conservation.
Yes. So the one other thing that we have been able to do because of the funding from Conservation International as well as from NACAO is we are now training a team of rangers that we hope will not just be trained in how to do surveys and so forth, but could also be bird guides. And in those situations, we can have the monetary benefits go directly to the community instead of a second party. And so we are starting to build the capacity for them to be able to do that, assuming folks like you are willing to take people out there. The one or two companies that have been in there that I know have done a great job, because there's one route where they built basically shelters up through the elevation, going up to higher elevations, and the communities themselves are aware and can be used as guides. And so I really appreciate that you're sensitive to the culture. It's still a very conservative kind of culture, and so that's really important. But I do see that the infrastructure is starting to be built where there's enough of the younger generation that understand ecotourism, and birding is one of them, where they could serve as guides. Happy to interact, happy to communicate with you once if you want, and I can offer suggestions of people to talk to when you're there.
Thanks. Are there any more questions before we wrap up?
I don't have any questions, but I just want to say thank you to Al. This was a really, really interesting talk, and my background in biology, I'm really fascinated about evolution, and especially the sort of micro details, and it is really amazing when you start delving into it at that level. So thank you very much.
Of course, and this is a pleasure. I always like kind of trying to spread our science in a more a better way than just simply talking to other scientists.
And Faraz asks if you could please share your email address in the chat box.
Okay.
I think some people want to contact you.
Here you go.
Cool, that's great. Thanks.
Yes, feel free to shoot me an email. Happy to correspond.
Okay. Are there any more questions? It looks like we're done for this evening. Thanks so much, Al. That was really so fascinating. I've learned so much. Thank you very much for that talk.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And thanks, everybody. We'll see you in Antarctica in November.